Any views or opinions expressed in this podcast are strictly the views or opinions of the presenter. Nothing in here is the view of the firms, corporations, financial entities that anybody represents. Nothing expressed here is a view of any regulator or semi-regulatory agency. All content is intended to be educational. Nothing in this episode construes specific investment advice, and if you do require advice, you should seek an appropriate advisor, be that a financial planner or a tax advisor or possibly a lawyer. Hi, this is Jason Watt, and welcome back to the CE Drive podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk with Professor Jodi Letkiewicz. Jodi is a financial planning prof at York in Toronto, and this episode is going to be good for one credit in British Columbia, one life credit in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario. It'll be good for credits in all those jurisdictions. It'll be good for an IAS credit, a financial planning credit, an IROC professional development credit, and an MFDA financial planning credit. So the whole range of credits, no ANS for those in Alberta. All right, the interview's fairly long here, and I think we explained everything. I don't think I have a lot to do outside of the work itself that Jodi did here. She did all the heavy lifting in this one. All right, the object for today is a book. This is Lori Power's new book. I can't even include a link to it because my list of show notes is so long for this episode. But hey, go over to Lori. So Lori's a past show guest. This book is They'll Never Know. I know it backwards here. The book is They Never Know. I had lunch with Lori last week, and she gave me an early copy of the book. I don't want to say an advanced copy because that sounds fancier than it is. But Lori's she's a prolific author. You can go to her Amazon author page and buy a book and leave her a good review. And she's got lots of different stuff on there. Some insurance stuff, some fiction, some kids books, cookbook, if I remember right. So again, that's Lori Power, past show guest. So thanks, Lori. All right, with that, let's roll into the interview with Jodi. I'm here today with Jodi Letkiewicz. Jodi is a prof in the financial, well, actually, I think technically not in financial planning. I can't remember exactly how it breaks down, but you're a financial planning prof at York. Is that fair, Jodi?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
And I don't remember what the departmental breakdown here is. I know financial planning is one of those things that kind of gets shoehorned in sometimes finance, sometimes human ecology.
Yeah,
consumer...
we're in a finance department, and we have three streams of finance. So we've got like a corporate finance, investment or wealth management, and then you've got the financial planning stream. So we fit right in there.
And one of the few schools in Canada with a dedicated post-secondary, like undergrad financial planning degree program. I think that's right, Jodi?
Yeah. I mean, you don't get your degree like in financial planning, right? But it would say finance, and then you would choose the dedicated stream. But we are one of the very few post-secondary institutions that offer a dedicated stream in financial planning.
We're going to talk about the U.S.-Canada comparison a little bit later on here. Before we do, I got to get a little bit more bio out of you. So you're not from Toronto. You didn't do your undergrad at York or anything like that. So can you talk about your path to a PhD in is it financial planning here too, or consumer science? I don't remember your PhD actually, Jodi, and how that landed you where you're at. So
it's tricky. Yeah. I actually had an undergrad in accounting from Miami University, which is a small public university in Ohio. And then I worked for a while, and I went back and I went to Ohio State, and Ohio State has a program, gosh, it's moved since then, but it's basically in the human ecology department, and it's consumer sciences. And so that program, there's three different focuses. One is textiles and clothing, another is hospitality management, and then financial planning. And so my focus was that, and I think my degree actually says family resource management.
Interesting. Is that where, I don't remember his last name, is that where Sherman's at? He's at
Yep, Sherman Hanna.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sherman Hanna, thank you. All right, Sherman's sort of at a lot of US financial planning conferences. Sherman is one of the, I'm going to say, like,
Sherman's at all of
godfathers of
them.
financial.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
He's sort of a
Okay.
giant in the field.
Yeah, there you go. All right. And what then, so you said accounting to start. What drove you from accounting over to financial planning slash
Well,
human
I
ecology?
actually moved from accounting real quickly. All my work was never in accounting, but the reason I got interested in financial planning was just honestly out of curiosity. I would talk to a lot of friends about finances, and I would just notice, like, I tend to be more conscientious around money, and I was always told to save early, and I really did that. Saved early, saved often, but I saw all these other friends and family members and relatives making very different decisions. And I just thought, like, why is that? Like, that you're going to have to retire. And I'm like 25, right? But you're going to have to retire. Why aren't you doing that? And I got really curious about the consumer behavior element in financial planning. And so I thought at the time, well, I'll go get my master's and then I'll be a financial planner. And then while I was there, I thought, oh, I actually don't know that I want to work one-on-one with people. I'm interested in the bigger, broader questions, and the way that you can do that is through research.
So have you actually done financial planning work with one-on-one clients, or have you always been pure academic stream?
I've been, I would say 99% academic stream. As part of, I'm a CFP, and as part of that, I had to do some financial planning work. And so I worked with a firm in Canada to kind of get those hours, but it was also just great experience working with their clients and working on those financial plans.
I'm sorry, CFP US, CFP Canada, both?
Canada, CFP
Okay,
Canada.
interesting. I don't think I knew that, so that's cool. Now, what then brought you to York? What's, I guess, given that York is sort of an outlier in Canada, having that financial planning concentration, what's the motivation there from, say, I don't know, like an institutional perspective at York?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there were so many factors that went into it, but I had just graduated in 2012, and I took a job at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and they were in a child, youth, and family studies program. So, right, like they're just tucked into the most interesting places. And I really liked that school. I liked the program. But then I saw the opportunity at York, and I'm just in it. I like adventure, and I like learning new things. And I thought, I bet that would be a good challenge. Like, I wonder what it's like. And I met with Dale Domian and Chris Robinson, who were both professors at York, and talked to them about the opportunity there. And yeah, and it just felt like the right decision at the time.
Dale really is like a traditional finance prof. I think that's fair. And Chris sort of transcends between financial planning
Well,
and
Dale's
finance. Is
actually,
that
his
right?
PhD is in economics.
Oh, I didn't know
But
that. Okay. Yeah.
but he teaches, he's much more on the investment side. And then
Yeah.
Chris was more of a traditional finance math guy, actually. He would say finance. And him and Kwok Ho got really interested in the personal finance side, just from a personal interest. And they just thought, why are we not teaching this? There's so many things that people need to learn, and they created that stream.
Perfect. And yes, they have a financial planning textbook that's fairly well used across, I think, North American programs. I don't think it's just a Canadian text.
Well, I think right now it has been, but right now, the latest version is only a Canadian version.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah. So I think the version I have on my shelf is maybe 12 or 15 years old, something like that.
Yeah,
So,
and I mean,
yeah.
the newest one just came out. I helped him out with that one. I joined efforts, and that one I think is officially out last year.
Okay. Perfect. I haven't seen it yet, so I gotta get to the
Yeah, I
right
don't think it's in
conferences or
print
whatever.
form. I think it's just, we're using the online version for classes right now, but I think they're hoping to get it out for next year.
Perfect. Okay. Now, can you talk me through a little bit about what happens in the York financial planning program? Sort of what students do you bring in, and then what students do you turn out?
Well, honestly, one of our challenges is we're not very well known. And so students just kind of fumble into our program, right? They've taken an introductory course, or in their third year, well, like at York, they're all business students. So at least in our program. So the first 2 years is basically all the business prerequisites. And then in your third and fourth year, you specialize. And for finance students, they have to take 3 classes. They have to take basically an introduction to corporate finance, an introduction to investment planning, and an introduction to financial planning. And then based on those, they usually self-select into the stream based on which one they liked the best or were most interested in.
Do you find that, I guess my thought on this is always like thinking back to my university days, everybody that went to do Bachelor of Commerce sort of had this goal of working in like corporate finance or mergers and acquisitions or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So is it like there's an attempt to, I don't know, pull people away from that? Or do you think that it's,
I mean, we try to have honest conversations with them. A lot of them are like, I don't need an investment banker. I'm going to Wall Street or, Bay Street or whatever. And, I always tell this story. Can I tell this little story here?
Story's good, yes.
This is a little story I tell to my students. And I had a friend who was an investment banker when I lived out on the West Coast. And it was my friend's husband. And he was just gone all the time and working these crazy hours. And, one day, another friend of mine, it was Monday morning, he's at the Starbucks. He looks over and he sees our other friend there and he's in flip-flops and shorts. And he says, wow, a casual day at the office, Chuck. And Chuck looks at him, he says, I've been here since Saturday at 11 a.m. Like I was called in at Saturday and I have not left. And I say, you're the kind of job that you want, you really have to look at the industry that you're going into and the balance that you want to strike with your life and your work. And do you want to be somebody who's called away at 11 o'clock on a Saturday while you're at the beach to work, right, for 48 hours straight? Or do you want a little bit more flexibility? And I think students, sometimes they're like, yeah, that's exactly what I want. I'm going to make millions of dollars, right? And other students kind of get it.
Yeah, I had a fellow I used to do some work with in the education side, and his first job out of school was he was a currency manager, like a foreign currency manager. Mm-hmm. And he said for his first 2 years, he never he was waking up in the middle of the night because of job requirements. He said in that 2 years, he never had more than 2 consecutive hours of sleep.
Yeah, it's just crazy.
It is madness. These and I think you're right. I think if people were sort of aware of what those, especially early years, those finance jobs entail, they would really look at it and think, yeah.
Well, and I always think too, just from a human rights perspective, like how do we allow that to be the case, those working environments to be the case? But somehow
that's a fair point.
Somehow they persist.
I think everybody thinks they're going to be Bill Ackman, but you realize that there's whole machine behind that. So
yeah.
Okay, so then, and I see this a little bit with U.S. educators. I know we talk about this sometimes, but how many folks do you figure finish your program who go on then to work in financial planning?
That's a great question, and that's something we've been trying to track a little bit better. I'm going to say it's not a very high percentage because a lot of students, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and one of the reasons is the entryway into financial planning is not straightforward. A lot of times it's sales and commission or just jobs that are very not tailored to what a 22 or a 23-year-old can do. And so it's very discouraging for them. And they end up just taking, a job with, one of the big banks or one of the insurance companies because they can't really find a direct way into financial planning. And now some certainly have and are, but that's a real barrier.
I would agree with that. I guess given your perfect world, then I'm assuming that, your students would graduate and there would be, a number of like salaried financial planning jobs available where they're really producing financial planning outputs. Would that be?
Yeah, like a paraplanner.
Right.
Like we don't really have a lot of paraplanners in Canada, and that's a great position for these students. Like they know all of the mechanics of financial planning, but they need to really get their hands on it and see the plans to come together from the back end before they're ready to move forward. And that's such a great place for them. And I, for whatever reason, we just haven't been able to, you know, the industries in Canada haven't been able to make that successful.
And yeah, I think in Canada, the sort of what would pass as paraplanner jobs are almost exclusively high net worth planning jobs where, you know, you're often looking for, you know, CPA, CFP, or some combination like that, right? It's not, I don't find a lot of paraplanning work happening at the mass affluent level.
No, the only thing that like sometimes you would see it in, you know, in banks, they may become like customer service representative reps, right? Where they're basically tellers working their way up that way. And that's like, to me, that's not a job that they are way overqualified for that job. But that is one way that sometimes they find a way in.
Even there, though, typically they're going to be doing a pretty sales heavy role
Yep.
in that career path somewhere.
It's very transactional and salesy. It's not relationship building and really financial planning.
Yeah, that's fair. On that note, actually, do your students get sales training as part of their undergrad?
No.
Okay. Do you think that is there a way to do that? Is that something that just doesn't fit in a like a university environment, or?
I mean, you know, we're in a business school, so certainly we've got a marketing wing and a entrepreneurship, you know, track. And one of the things that we've been thinking about, we do have a track specifically in entrepreneurship. And so one idea is to look at, you know, we're doing a couple merged classes to give them some background in that. But honestly, and this is going to be my own bias and philosophy coming, but I just don't think financial planners should be in the business of sales.
I mean, there's always like everybody is selling something at some point, right? There's always
It's
that.
true. It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. I guess it's like, I don't, particularly where they are, I don't know that they should be out selling products that they don't fully understand and haven't seen how they work in plans.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's a difference there between selling product and then selling somebody on the idea of building a financial planning relationship and having a financial like those. Well, it's sales and sales. It's not necessarily. It's not the same kind of thing, I think.
Yeah, but your point's well taken. It is, there's still a sales component. I mean, we're all selling ourselves all the time, unfortunately.
Now, do you have an ideal student?
I mean, honestly, like, I think we all have an ideal student. You know, the ideal student is, you know, motivated and curious and really wants to. I think that the ideal student is somebody who even has like a bit of experience and can really take the material and bring it to life. But we don't really have that. Usually we have students who have never really seen this before. But my ideal students, my favorite students, are the ones that are just really curious. They're not just taking what you've taught them. They're taking it and asking really thoughtful questions.
I do agree about curiosity. To me, that's the number one thing. And I try to promote that curiosity. It's a tough thing.
It's a tough thing. And a lot of students are not taught to think that way. Unfortunately, that's one of the things that I run into, is that they're really taught to learn the material, respond to the questions, and then, you know, they get to post-secondary and we're like, why aren't they thinking critically? Well, they haven't necessarily been required to do that.
So now there's not that many. You might be the only one, the only, I think, PhD in, like, there's a few people like Moshe Malevsky and Bonnie Jean McDonald, and like that are essentially actuarial sciences folks who do some financial planning work. There's the folks at HEC in Montreal, HEC in Montreal. There's, I think, a little bit of math folks at Laurier doing some financial planning work, but you're kind of a rarity here, being a PhD with that focus in financial planning. Am I about right there?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I would say that my degree wasn't necessarily financial planning, right? Like, family resource management could go a lot of directions. And one of the directions that we found that is a major for students is financial planning. So I didn't get like a PhD in financial planning. I got a PhD in something much more broad than that, and then found a path in financial planning.
That's fair. And I think there's only, was there 4 schools in the US right now doing financial planning PhDs? It's not very many anyways.
I mean, that number's changing. There are, and again, the financial planning PhD, I think there's only really, I think Georgia and Texas Tech and Kansas, maybe Missouri have that title. Please, anybody out there, I apologize if I got that wrong. But other schools have more broad, like Ohio State has an undergraduate degree that they can get, and we come out with family resource management PhDs, and others, some business schools now are starting to do that, or people will come out with a finance PhD with a very specific concentration in some field of personal finance.
So what do you see as the differences then? And we just started to explore it a little bit here. So, what you're doing at York or other programs in Canada versus what you see in the US, and maybe at the undergrad level.
Yeah. Do we have time for just like a 3-minute history lesson?
Yes, that's what
I
you're here
think
for.
this is really important to understand the difference between Canada and the US in the financial planning world. So back in the late 1800s, like 1860 something or other, the federal government in the US passed something called the Morrill Act. And what that did is it created public funding for land grant institutions. So the US has a number of land grant institutions, which are publicly funded. Some of them have become private over time, but they're publicly funded. They were started by the federal government granting land to these states and saying, go ahead and sell it and use the funds to build these universities. And by the way, we want these universities to be focused on more technical and applied fields such as like agriculture and economics rather than liberal arts, right? So each of the 50 states has a land grant institution, and also like some of the historically Black colleges came out of this. And so they have these publicly funded education, and what's cool about them is every state's got them. And then they said, and the point of these is to conduct research that is applied. So you've got economics, agricultural economics, and they said, and you are going to use this extension model. So there's one university in the state, and now there's all these extension offices in all the counties around the state. And they said, you do the research and you send it out to the farmers, right? You send it out to people that need it. So you do research on soil quality and fertilizer, and you send it out to the farmer so they can actually use it. And from that little history lesson, each of these land grant institutions had this they had home economics programs, and home economics programs initially were to create teachers to go out to schools to teach home economics. But at a broader level, they were studying things like, how does a farm manage its resources? How does it produce food? How does it make clothing? Like, how do they manage the money coming in and out? And that is something that the US had a focus on that I don't think Canada did as much. And from those schools, a few of them have grown out this financial planning specialization. It sort of modernized what used to be the case. So Texas Tech, University of Georgia, Kansas State, Iowa State, those are all land grant institutions that now have these financial planning programs. So they have a long history of studying these sort of things, and it's just sort of modernized over time.
It's interesting. I never clued into that. That's a good connection of the history to the present condition. So in Canada, then, really, I would say financial planning programs, compared to what you're just talking about, are more like there's financial planning happening, and at U of C, we can start teaching some financial planning courses. Is that about right? To just kind of drop it in?
I think the difference is the history of the US is that these financial planning programs come from a very rich history that has changed over time. And so they are dealing with things like, they're parked in child, youth, and family studies programs. They are looking more at the family and the household holistically, not just from let's create a personal finance major in a finance, a business school. There's very different philosophies when you start to look at how financial planning is taught at a place like Georgia or Texas Tech versus like even a place like York or another business school, right? Because when you're in a business school, it's different courses and a different focus.
Interesting. So yeah, and I think that's true. I'm most familiar with the University of Calgary program, which in some way, shape, or form dates back to like 1982, but looks kind of like this, right? Where essentially there was a business school and a prof at the business school thought we should bring in some financial planning courses, and it kind of sits, I don't know what the right word is. It's like another set of finance courses in the curriculum, and really not much more than that. So yeah. Now, are there other schools like, I think York brought you on to kind of grow this financial planning capacity. Am I right there?
I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily. I think that they wanted some more expertise in the area of personal finance. They saw it as an area of growth. And since then, like Chris Robinson, who started the program, he's since retired. And we've hired 2 new faculty members, which is sort of exciting. And so, but there's always challenges to what we can do with the program, and we're always trying to think about new ways and how to better position ourselves. That's not even the right way to say it, of what is needed in Canada and how can we help that? How can we help serve?
So are there other schools that are doing the same stuff as at York?
Not that I know of. There are schools that are, like you said, like University of Calgary, that have some courses, but I don't know of any that are dedicated, that have a dedicated stream and dedicated faculty for financial planning like York does.
That makes sense. Now, do you find that when you're especially because you're in a business school or finance school, right? Do you find that you're having to constantly remind people that financial planning is not just like investment selection?
Yes and no. With our finance faculty, because Chris and Kwok have been there for so long, they have really like drilled it in, and nobody in finance is not familiar. Like everybody knows what financial planning is within the finance area. More broadly than that, I think that people think it's investment, and we're always having conversations with like the marketing folks on the consumer behavior side, and we've made some really good connections so we can talk about those sorts of things. And what are you teaching, and how might that be able to help in this field?
Do you see Canadian practitioners, do you have conversations with Canadian practitioners about pursuing masters or PhDs in financial planning? It's very common
they
in the
would
US.
like to. They would like to. And unfortunately, there are no programs in Canada. We've certainly bounced that around, but there are some impediments to that at York, I will say. But yeah, honestly, like when people talk to me about it, the best option that we have for them is we point them to the university or to Kansas State's online program that they can get their master's or their PhD. And again, it's not focused on Canadian specific, but it does give you all of the things that you need, right? It's like retirement planning. The only difference between retirement planning in the US and Canada are the vehicles that you're using to put your money in, but most of it is pretty much the same.
And I know a few folks who have done their masters at K-State, Canadians, and had nothing but good things to say about it. I know Tanya, past show guest, Tanya Staples, is currently working on her master's at K-State. She's at your way in Kitchener-Waterloo. So yeah, there are some Canadians doing it, but I don't find it's all that common.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's one of those things that like hits me, a couple times a year, and I'm like, we really need to do this. And then there's some barriers to it that we haven't solved yet.
Right. That's right. I misspoke. Tanya's pursuing her PhD, not her master's. Tanya, don't
Well,
have
I
to
think she
correct me.
might
Yeah.
have to get her master's first. So technically, unless
She has a master's already,
okay.
so not yeah. So this is where I had to
Okay.
correct myself. I know right away that she has a master's already. So yeah, okay. Yes, because I've looked at the K-State program myself. I just got to navigate a schedule. You and I have chatted about this, so
I mean,
yeah,
it's a great program. If it's expensive for Canadians.
that's right. Yeah. Among the cost is not my impediment. The time is my impediment here.
Mhm.
So yeah. Um, so then I'd like to talk a little bit about research in financial planning. This is an area for me. I remember my first time going to the CFP Board Economic Research Colloquium and just being blown away that there's actual financial planning research happening.
Yeah.
Like it was a foreign concept to me. So can you just talk a little bit about research in the financial planning sphere in general? Can you give us a little background
Yeah,
here?
and what's interesting to me is since I started down this path in 2008, it's really the research has really grown, but also focused. So back when I started, there wasn't like this CFP board in the US, their financial planning journal. That didn't exist then. And so now there's a journal specifically dedicated to financial planning research. Now, in the past, there were journals where you could publish financial planning research, but it wasn't dedicated to that, right? They were like consumer policy journals, or one is the Review of Financial Services, or Financial Services Review, sorry. And so that's Financial Services Review very broadly. So there's all kinds of variation within that. But now there's at least one journal that's more tailored specifically to financial planning. There's also the Journal of Financial Counseling and Planning. So that's been around for a really long time. But again, that also has financial counseling research. There's also the Journal of Financial Therapy, which is looks more at financial therapy than financial planning, but also has some topics for sure that would be of interest to financial planners in that journal.
Yeah, that's so I think you're right, 4 or 5 sort of journals where you would see financial planning research published where it kind of fits into that category. So and of course nothing in Canada, no Canadian journals that mirror any of this.
No, not really. No, not at all, actually.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, and that's partially just like the size and the audience, and because you have all these PhD programs in the US focusing on that, they're generating the research that contributes to the journal, whereas in Canada there's just sort of one-offs and they're mostly just publishing in the US journals.
And what about then, like if I'm a Canadian practitioner and I want to read, current research, I want to see what's going on, then what should I be accessing?
I think that there's a number. I'm actually just in real time looking it up so I get it.
It's all good. Yeah.
Financial Planning Review. That's the journal that the CFP board is supporting. So that's probably the primary one. And I would also then say the Journal of Financial Counseling and Planning is also a good one. In the journal, like I said before, the Journal of Financial Therapy. Financial Services Review, you may find something in there, but it's not going to be as much as Financial Planning Review.
I found Financial Services Review, like that's a dense academic journal. And I find with Financial Services Review, you get kind of a mix. You get some articles and some journal articles, and a lot of consumer finance or consumer behavior stuff in Financial Services Review, which is good. It's interesting, but I don't know if it's directly applicable.
Some of the stuff is a little bit esoteric and very, the thing with research is you're very rarely going to have the research paper that like blows everything open, right? Everybody is just doing an incremental test or an incremental thing at a time.
Sorry, Jodi.
Okay.
Just for the listener, I have a sick girl at home today, so it's some interruptions here and there. This is COVID, right? So this is how it goes. Okay,
It's
so
all right.
yeah. So what about
I think
then
the
research?
other journal I just want to mention is the Journal of Financial Planning. That's also quite good because there's a lot of applied research in the Journal of Financial Planning.
I do really like Journal of Financial Planning, and that's one you can join the FPA US, which is pretty inexpensive for a Canadian and access
Yeah.
it that way. So, and I was thinking you had missed it, but I don't want to ask it, and you say something negative about it. I thought, what have I
No,
missed here? So,
no,
yeah.
I was, I'm cataloging them in my head, and the problem with them is their names are all so similar that
Mm.
it's like, did I already say that one? It's like Financial Planning Review, Journal of, they're all so similar that I always think I have forgotten.
So, so do you have researchers that you think are just can't miss, like where you see them in the byline that you say that's one that I know is going to be worth reading?
Not necessarily. And I only say that because the kind of in research that I'm more interested in, somebody like your typical researcher is gonna, like I said before, they're gonna be doing all this like small incremental research that leads someplace. And so sometimes they'll have, like there was one paper that Lynch, he's at a University of Colorado Boulder. It was basically on financial literacy, and they did this massive meta study that showed that less than 1% of financial behaviors are attributable to financial literacy. And basically just showed how study after study after study shows that like financial literacy efforts just don't work. Right. And so every once in a while, a paper like that comes out and just kind of blows your mind a little bit. And it's like you kind of knew that that was happening, but the way that they structured the study and showed it was very effective.
Seen that one, so I'll have to have a look at that. And I remember that's John Lynch, I think, right? That's
John
his name.
Lynch. Yeah, John Lynch.
Yeah.
And I actually don't even think his name is the first author. I think Fernandez is the first author, but everybody remembers it as John Lynch.
Because he's very well known on that consumer sciences side and
Well,
so
he
forth.
is,
So
and he has been hosting a consumer decision making conference in Boulder, Colorado, for the last several years. So people also know him through that.
it's fair. Yeah. One day I'll get to that conference. So then, and that's interesting, this like incremental approach to research. And I do agree with you. It's interesting to see people kind of come up with one little bit at a time. Now, you and I chatted a little bit before before the recording started, about where you're at with your research. And you said COVID is giving you kind of an opportunity for a reset here. Can you chat about that a bit?
Yeah, when you're doing research, you kind of get into, like, I study a lot of financial behaviors of like young adults, right? And that takes me in lots of different directions. And sometimes, a research question pops up and it's like, oh, that would be interesting. So let's chase that down. But I wasn't really that convinced that what I was researching was what was most important, right? There's, it's kind of what you're interested in. There's a little Venn diagram of like, what are you interested in? What can you actually do? And what are other people interested in? And like that sweet spot in the middle is where you should be focusing your time. And I just realized I needed to step back because I was doing research projects for the sake of doing research projects and burning myself out and not really that interested in what I was doing. And I just thought, you know what, I've got enough on the go. I'm just going to finish those off. I'm going to take a break, and then I'm going to restart when I feel like I have gas in the tank and a real interest in what I'm studying and what I think are questions that the greater public could, would like to know as well.
So, to my mind, one of the big impediments in financial planning research is the availability of really useful data, because it's incredibly expensive to go gather new data, right?
Oh, it's expensive, it's complicated, it's time consuming. And the difference between the US and Canada is the US just has more resources for that. Not that Canada doesn't have great research or great data sets. We've got StatsCan out there that's doing amazing work, but they don't quite get to the detail that some of the data sets in the US. So the US has something called the Survey of Consumer Finances. and they over survey wealthier individuals, and they ask questions about asset allocation and very specific things about retirement plans. And you can get really nitty and gritty about your questions with that kind of data set. And then there's a health and retirement survey, which surveys older adults. And then you've got the National Longitudinal Study for Youth. And so there's all these data sets that in the US that have very granular financial data that we just don't have. We do have some of that in Canada, but not to the same extent.
Essentially, StatsCan is sort of the resource in Canada, whereas you have all these different entities in the US. Now,
Exactly.
What about getting data from financial services firms? So whether it's banks or mutual fund companies,
you would be surprised at how willing they are to share that information. It's, for them, it's their proprietary client information. Certainly, there have been instances where researchers have partnered with various financial planning firms to get some of that information. And that's worked. I haven't had a need to do that yet for what I want to do, although some of the research questions that are coming up now may lend itself to that.
Yeah. I have, like, there has been some stuff that I've been surprised at. I know of 2 Canadian banks that have, like, there's the Misguided Beliefs of Financial Advisors paper, which is a well-known paper that was based on Canadian bank data. And then I remember Derek Tharp had some research that was based on like Canadian bank data that was based on like behavioral nudges and how those played out.
So that's definitely an option. It's just that it's a harder process to go about than it is. If you want to use a public data set, you just sign up and you download the data and get started, right? So any researcher can do that. And if you want to use, like, I partnered on one with Equifax, TransUnion, not Equifax, TransUnion, on getting some of their data. And so that was a partnership with a nonprofit, and we were able to get that, but it was a very challenging process. And the data was just also, the data that you get from these larger data sets is a lot cleaner. So we partnered with we partnered with a nonprofit and did a project with TransUnion. So we got credit reporting data from them that was privatized, so we couldn't see like who the people were, but we got enough of the information that we could do the research, answer our research questions that way.
And is TransUnion's assumption there that you're going to produce something that helps them to have a better interaction with their customers or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, the research question that we were asking in that project was, what's the difference between, like, who's faring better, those who file bankruptcy, a consumer proposal, or do a debt management plan? And we looked at a number of measures to try to figure that out. And from their perspective, TransUnion's not like, oh, that's going to, help us. But it is a very good question to be asking, right? Because they are working very closely with these financial institutions and keeping that data, and those institutions are using that data to make decisions. And so they want to make sure that that data, at least that they can contribute to the policy making in that area. I guess I would say it that way.
Is there a finding you can share around that?
Well, I mean, yes and no. It was sort of dependent on very specific measures that we were looking at. But we found in a lot of cases, like in some cases, we found that people recovered faster if they filed bankruptcy. In some cases, if they did a debt management plan, but the findings were very nuanced. So it wasn't just like oh yeah, of course, like everybody should file bankruptcy or everybody should do this.
Any good financial planning question? It depends.
Well, yeah, it depends. And also, the thing about that we were looking at was we wanted to see how long it took people to rebound after a negative financial event like that. And we found that, in many cases, they were able to rebound within like 18 to 24 months, which I think in itself is a positive finding for people who find themselves in that position, because when you're in it, you feel really desperate. Like, either and for a lot of people too, this isn't just like a series of bad financial decisions, right? Something catastrophic usually happens, like, your own, whether it's a divorce or a death or a loss of a job or some life event triggers, and then you find yourself in this place. And so I think that was the positive finding from that, was that no matter what path you chose, within 18 to 24 months, you were back up where you were.
I would have guessed longer. I would have guessed closer to 3 years, but yeah, that's
yeah. But you definitely still see it climbing, but the real, there was a real trough, and then the peak, right? And then they would come up out of it.
that's good to know. That's positive and useful research.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I like it. Okay, so then what about financial planners, like practitioners participating in research? And again, this is something I see a fair bit in the US, and I don't know if I've seen it that much in Canada.
No, it's definitely something we've been thinking about as well, because there's a couple things. One, financial researchers need to know what financial planners, there's two things. One, financial planners have information that researchers can use. And two, financial planners have questions that they want answered that researchers can help answer. So there's both of those things. And so I think in a lot of ways, like I joined like the AOP roundtable to just kind of get a sense of what they're talking about and what people, what financial planners' problems are. Like, what are they facing? What is the industry facing? So that I can go back to my colleagues and say, is this something that we can help with, or is this information? And so that's one thing I would say, is if there are financial planners out there that are like, I just don't think there's been a good resolution to this problem, right? Whether it's like the, decumulation or withdrawal strategy in retirement. Like and talking with researchers and saying, like, this is the problem that we're seeing. We need more information, or we need this or that. That really helps us to formulate the research questions that are then very applicable and helpful.
AOP is advice only planners. I think this is
advice only planners. Yeah, sorry.
There we go.
The
Yeah.
advice
Okay.
only
No
planner
worries.
roundtable. That's a
Yeah.
couple once a year, I think.
And we just had Chris Enns on the podcast recently, who
Okay.
talked about the same thing. So yeah, perfect. Okay. Now, what about then? So you mentioned this research from John Lynch et al., or I guess John Lynch is part of the et al. In this case, but around financial literacy, and it's something you and I have chatted about. I think you are still involved in some financial literacy efforts, or are you, or am I, or is this something that's fallen off a bit?
I've had let me just tell you what it is. So I really was interested in financial literacy for a while, and through, conference after conference, reading all these papers, and the John Lynch paper, the Fernandez and Lynch paper really solidified it for me. But financial literacy, the way that we think of it, does not work. And part of that is, and it kind of goes, but there was this other paper by Willis.
This is the Australian paper, right? This is Willis, right?
Willis.
Isn't she?
No, I don't think it was Australian.
I thought she was Australian. Okay.
She's American. This was in like the Iowa Review or something.
Yeah.
But that was in 2008, and also basically said financial literacy doesn't work. And not only does it not work, it's an excuse for companies to make their products more and more complicated and then blame the consumer. And honestly, Jason, that's where I've come down to, is saying, you can't on one side of your mouth, talk and make things more complicated for the consumers. And then on the other one, just say, well, it's your fault because you didn't know any better. Like, you can't make these products that complicated and also put in all these tricks and traps and then blame people for it. And so I started to get really kind of, really discouraged when I saw that. And I also just, a lot of the financial literacy research was kind of reiterating similar themes, and I just sort of got tired of it.
Saw a presentation this year, not published yet, at CFP Board Academic Research Colloquium, that sort of said the same thing, that, essentially financial literacy didn't seem to have a meaningful outcome. And really, it was that people with money could recover from bad decisions and people without money couldn't. Like that's what it seemed to come down to. So yeah, I like you, I used to put in some volunteer work on the financial literacy side, and you kind of figure this is what's necessary. Intuitively, it seems to make sense, but it's it it doesn't seem to have the impact. Now, I, I don't know. My thought on this has been, and I think this is partly drawing on Anna Marie Lusardi, is that the biggest thing you can impart in somebody is that there are answers to questions, not necessarily that they know the answers. Is that an angle that does work, or is it
Yeah, I
still
mean, one
fruitless?
thing that we're looking at too is like financial, self-efficacy and resilience. And there's all these other sort of buzzwords that are coming, but it's a combination of, yeah, like almost knowing it's better that people build confidence and a sense of self-efficacy around finances than it is about the knowledge, right? Or just giving them information. So we want people to know that they can help themselves.
To my mind, it's useless for most people to walk around with knowledge of, let's say, how a mortgage works. But at the time when I'm taking out a mortgage, I should know what questions to ask. Is that
Yeah, and that's in that Fernandez Lynch paper, they talk about just-in-time education, and they find that just-in-time education is quite effective. So yeah, teaching an 18-year-old about a mortgage that they're going to take out in 20 years is not helpful, right? They're not going to remember that. There's a decay, right, that happens in learning, and so they're not going to remember that. But there are really good touch points where some education is really helpful.
Yeah, that's perfect. So I mean, I like this. I think there's some, and I look forward to reading this paper then. I think there's some real value in getting to, a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work. So
Yeah.
that's,
I
yeah.
mean, certainly we want to get to a place where people can make good decisions. And we also, coming from, my background in consumer sciences, and it's really a focus on the human, the person, the consumer. I hate the word consumer, but let's just go with it, right? Is on that person and like making sure that they are well, they are okay. And a lot of times we look at that and we see, well, throwing information at them is not helping them, right? What we need to do is to set up mechanisms that help people get out of trouble, or don't let them fall so far, right? We need safety nets in place.
So do you have, I don't want to deviate too much from the safety net conversation, but can I ask about like you talked about design versus, can I use nudges here? Is that okay? Or is this a
Yeah, yeah.
problematic word? Okay. So do you have favorite nudges? Are there things that we can be doing that would make our financial lives appreciably better?
The thing about nudges, and I also got really interested in behavioral economics and nudges for a while, and I still am to a certain extent. But to me, it's similar to financial literacy in that it's it's only going to help a little bit, right? It's not going to solve the systemic problems that we face in our financial services or in financial services, but some small things can really be helpful. Like my bank account has like a round up the change sort of thing, where anytime I pay something, it rounds up to the next dollar and moves that money into my savings account. Now that's great for people who really do not know to save, right? Or not do not know, they know to save. It's just that they can't pull the trigger to save, right? And maybe that over time, without them even thinking about it, it builds up a little safety net for them, right? So things like that, those kind of nudges are helpful. And also things like this is much more common or becoming common. I think they're even talking about instituting it into law in the US, that when you hire somebody, they have to be automatically opted into the retirement plan, and then automatically opted into their raises going into part of their raises going into the retirement plan. So those kinds of things can be massively helpful, particularly for people who wouldn't otherwise. Now, part of the problem with those is that people who might have and would have saved more aren't going to save as much as they would have, because they're like, oh, well, if 3% is what I'm opted in at, that must be the optimal amount, right? Which we all know is probably not, but it's better than nothing, and it's not going to, immeasurably harm their take-home pay.
I can't remember whose research it was, but I recall some research that that suggested that like 70% of people were better off with automated savings, and then 30, and of course it depends
Yeah.
always, right? But like 30% were better off if you told them you must save, and they would save more than on the automated plans. I think that number is
That's probably that sounds like a good breakdown. And the interesting thing about that is that we have a huge we're having a bigger and bigger problem with retirement savings when we've switched from defined contribution pension or defined benefit pensions to defined contribution, and are putting that more and more is getting offloaded to individuals to manage that. But what we forget is that, like, oh yeah, that sounds great in principle. Like the whole 401k thing was just like this one-off clause that has blown up into now it's this is a retirement. And even the person that wrote it was like, that was not the intention. But here we are, where we're all responsible for our own retirement without the skills or the ability to have any idea how to do that. And so I think that any time that we can simplify and automate for people things that used to be simplified and automated, right? Like getting back to that so that they don't have to make so many decisions.
So do you think that the CPP enhancement that we're sort of nearing now the end of, do you think this is a benefit?
I mean, I think that it was probably necessary, just given the state of CPP. And it's going to help a little bit, but again, CPP is only expected to replace up to 25% of your income, so it's still not real. It's people who are going to retire and rely on CPP are in for a rude awakening. So the enhancement will help a little bit, but that's not it's not intended to do much more than that.
By 2072, it'll be 33% of your income. So
2072.
that's
Perfect. Right. I don't know that
Yeah.
either of us will be here around to see that, but
I'm pretty sure not. So yeah. All right. If so, I mean, what good for us, right? So, any last comments about just the state of either financial literacy or research in general?
yeah, I think I just want to say I don't want my comments about financial literacy to discourage people that have really good intentions about wanting to help people. Sometimes I talk to a lot of people in the financial services industry, and they say, oh, we're going to launch this, financial literacy campaign or project. And I want to encourage those things. I just encourage those people to look at some of the research that shows what is helpful and what is not helpful. So the just-in-time education is really helpful, right? Broad topics aren't as helpful.
And I'll include a link certainly to the Lynch paper and the Willis paper here, and that helps. I think the Willis papers, and I've read it. It's pretty good in that it talks about, I don't know, like a conflict of interest almost in delivering this education. So
yeah. And I think that's important. It's just, again, people are coming at this in a way that they want to help, and I think that's great. And I don't want to discourage people who want to help, but I do say, if you want to help, let's look at some resources and make sure that the way that you're going about it really is going to help, and that you're not going to waste your time and your money and your energy and other people's in that pursuit.
Perfect. All right, my last question here, Jodi. What do you see as the primary benefit of a financial plan or of the financial planning process?
Oh gosh, honestly, peace of mind. Peace of mind. There are so many moving parts, and you just don't know. And people just want to know, like, can I sleep at night? Like, with the decisions that I'm making, can I sleep at night? And will I be able to retire? Am I going to be destitute? And for me, the financial planning is a way, like a financial plan is a way to allow people to sleep comfortably at night, and to have somebody that they can call when a problem comes up or something changes. And, it's not necessarily something they need to talk about every day, but if they're looking at their milestones and saying, okay, that gives them a little freedom, right? You can enjoy your vacation when you can really afford it, right? Whereas like putting it on your credit card and crossing your fingers, you might kind of enjoy that vacation, but you might also feel a little bit stressed the whole time. So I think for me, And that's what I hear from most people who get a financial plan is they just can, it's like they've been holding their breath and they don't realize it. And then they can finally let it out.
So this is my chance for my favorite Carl Richards quote here. And this is, am I going to be okay? Right. This is,
that's just it. Am I going to be okay? It's that simple. It's that simple. And I think the financial plans and financial planners offer just an invaluable service in helping people to answer that question.
that's a great point at which to conclude. Thanks so much, Jodi. It's always great to talk to you. I always learn so much from our conversations. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Same for you, Jason. I appreciated being on here today.
The number for today's episode is 6. The number is 6. My concluding comment here is I get a lot of questions about conference speakers and that kind of thing. A lot of people looking to fill slates. And there's some great conference speakers out there. We have some really solid folks here in Canada who sort of do the conference circuit. I want you to think about whether or not there might be an academic that you can get in. I've seen Jodi speak at a few different conferences. The CFA Edmonton Society used to bring her out once a year. And she was always excellent. She like very evidence-based, which of course the CFA Society loves. But there's lots of great profs in Canada, and I don't want to sort of downsell them, but they're often, relatively inexpensive. You can, book them in and they'll bring great value. They tend to be a little more challenging presentations than what you sometimes see from some of the more polished keynotes that, often challenge people to think a little bit, or, as we hear Jodi here, sort of, calls financial literacy into question. Well, that's not maybe a message people are comfortable with. So anyways, reach into that pool of academics and see if there's anybody out there that might be a great speaker for a next conference. Okay, thanks very much for joining me. And in 2 weeks' time, we're going to delve into the lifetime capital gains exemption with Jim. Thanks so much. Hi, if you're listening to this episode and you're not already signed up for CE credits, this is a very easy thing to do. Just navigate over to businesscareercollege.com and you're going to sign up here for CE. Just subscribe. Currently, the pricing is $200 a year. We may be introducing monthly pricing at some point, but as of today, we have a cost of $200 a year. And once you're signed up, then you can just go and listen to every episode within your subscriptions. So you'll use once you're logged in, you'll use my subscriptions here, and you'll just go to the latest episode, which you'll scroll down to very near the bottom for. It doesn't matter which episode, you just scroll down and you find the one. So as of the time I'm recording this, the most recent episode is season 4, episode 27. I can just start it right from here. I can do the quiz here. Once I'm done the quiz, then I can get my continuing education certificate. Very straightforward. So I would just launch the course here, and I can watch the episode from here. Now, if you happen to be already listening to it on YouTube or whatever the case is, you can just navigate right into the quiz. You start your quiz, and you're just going to go through the whole thing. And then at the end of it, you'll be able to see your certifications. So we're going to bring up designing small group products. We bring this up and we click on wall certificate, and that's going to give me the CE certificate I need in order to maintain status wherever I happen to need CE credits. So I really do encourage, I know that out of our regular listeners, about 40% of you are listening to the episode for CE credits. That's about 60% who are listening out of general interest or whatever it is. And I really think this is an easy way to get your CE credits. $200 a year, pretty reasonable price. And as you can see from the certificate here, and as you hear me discuss at the beginning of the episode, we have a broad range of approvals for all of our courses. I'd like to thank Joe Tong. Joseph is our editor, both for video and audio content. And Joe does a lot of good work to make sure that these episodes look and sound good, despite my better efforts. I'd like to thank Maria Nguyen. Maria makes sure that the episodes all get approved for CE credits. Veronica Tiber does the quality assurance through that process. And then we have a strong marketing team that makes sure that all of our content gets out there so that people can find us and take advantage of learning opportunity they might not have known about.